Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to the Dionandia podcast. This is Dr. Rewat Dionandan, global health epidemiologist, and you can find me at www.dionandan.com. That's DEONANDAN.com. This episode is my second conversation with Mr. Patrick Saunders Hastings, who is a very intelligent, well-informed individual on issues in public health and infectious diseases. And we're having some fun today. We're talking about three particular studies that hit the media pretty hard lately. One of them looked at the association between breastfeeding and intelligence, whether or not if you breastfeed your child, will it be a smarter child than if you don't breastfeed it. Another looked at whether or not the month in which you were born dictates the kind of health problems you will have later in life. And the last one was a study on homeopathic interventions for ADHD. All of these studies are media relevant for different kinds of reasons, and we quickly go over them and talk about their strengths, their flaws, their motivations, why the media is interested in them, and their implications, and so forth. So we had a good time, and hopefully you will as well. If you want access to copies of the papers that we're talking about, go to the website, dionandan.com, click on podcast, and scroll down to the relevant episode. I will include links to the papers. As well, I'll have a link to Patrick's biography and his LinkedIn profile. He's a very interesting, very bright young man, and I encourage more people to speak to him about public health and infectious disease issues. So, without further delay, here is my second interview with Patrick Saunders Hastings. Okay, welcome back, podcast listeners. This is Dr. Rewat Dionandan, epidemiologist and global health researcher and all-around fun guy. Whose hair is receding. And I'm here once more with Mr. Patrick Saunders Hastings, a PhD student extraordinaire. And we're going to talk about some exciting, problematic, sexy, and maybe misleading papers in public health and epidemiology right now. And before I do, a little more about Patrick. He's a PhD student in the Institute of Population Health at the University of Ottawa. Say hi, Patrick.
Hey everyone, on my second cup of coffee. I'm very excited to be here. A little shaky, but...
He's not really excited. I have him chained up here, and he can't leave until he records 3 podcasts for me and does some problem sets and marks and papers for my students.
That's how we do it at the University of Ottawa.
That's right. So today, I invited Patrick over to talk about a few papers. Now, neither one of us is an expert on the issues in these papers, but they're making their way in the media so much that I really want to talk to somebody on the record about them. And the first one I wanted to bring up, I'm not sure if Patrick has had a chance to look at these yet, it's called The Association Between Breastfeeding and Intelligence, Educational Attainment, and Income at 30 Years of Age, a prospective birth cohort study from Brazil. Now, I want to say that if you want a copy of this paper and any of the papers we're talking about, you can go to my website, dionandan.com, that's DEONANDAN.com, click on podcast, scroll down to the relevant episode, which is this one, whose title I don't know yet, but you'll find it, you're smart people, and I will include a link to download the paper. So this breastfeeding and intelligence article, essentially it's the world's biggest study attempting to show if you breastfeed your baby, it will be smarter than if you don't breastfeed your baby. Do you have any insights or comments first on the topic or the paper?
You know, my initial reaction was to cringe that we were going to be talking about this because I'm so anxious about telling mothers what to do with their babies, right? And I think some people might roll their eyes if they listen to your previous podcast about vaccinating your kids, but this is not my area of expertise, so I'm going to be very self-conscious the whole way through.
Anytime we talk about breasts, we should always be self-conscious.
With that said, to move past that, I was really impressed at just the size of data from this project. Yeah. It was clearly a really massive undertaking. Exciting that it came out so recently. And we can talk about the findings a little bit later.
Sure. Actually, why don't I say up front that the interpretation that the authors found was that breastfeeding is associated with improved performance in intelligence tests 30 years later and might have an important effect in real life by increasing educational attainment and income in adulthood. In other words, they're saying that if you breastfeed your child, it will be smarter. Now, by my reading, this paper has one scary fatal flaw. I'm wondering if you picked it up, because I know you skimmed it really fast.
I'm curious to hear it.
Okay, let me test Patrick here for a second.
It's funny because I got these about 2 hours ago, so a lot of what I read about them was the news stories about it.
Exactly,
right?
and this is fascinating, isn't it? The news just jumped all over this. It's such a sexy topic, and I've had my papers also been jumped on by the news in the past, and I'm a big egotist, so I loved it, and I let them go whatever direction they wanted with those papers, recognizing that very often they just extracted the sexy, saleable, fun part of it and ignored the caveats. Now, in the actual paper, they don't really mention the important caveat here, which is the critical one. Do you know what the biggest predictor of intelligence for a child is?
No,
most people don't. It's the intelligence of the mother. Right? And no study that attempts to look at intelligence of children can be considered of good quality unless they have controlled to some extent for the intelligence of the mother. What they've attempted to do here, though, is to have a proxy measurement of intelligence by looking at the mother's educational attainment. Mm-hmm. Now, you see the problem there, right? Spell it out for the listener.
Educational attainment does not necessarily correlate to IQ point.
And a good example of that is sitting right in front of you. You got a PhD who's a dumbass. So
now, are you talking about yourself or me here, right?
I
still have some hot coffee left.
I'm being vague deliberately. Right, and so this is the problem. So let me explain the design to the listener. They begin sometime in the past with a bunch of Brazilian women who were having kids, and they follow them up 30 years later, the children, to see what happened to them. Did they end up with high IQ or low IQ? And they're able to test the children, but they did not test the mothers. And that's...
So I was looking at... We ended up in similar places because my initial reaction was, do breastfeeding practices change across social strata? And they say... In Brazil, no, it doesn't. Everyone breastfeeds equally. So maybe that it's either a big oversight on their part, or if that's true, then maybe that might cancel out some of that link that you're talking about.
An element that no one really talks about is the politics of breastfeeding. Mm-hmm. Right? And I wonder how much of this is driven by a desire to marginalize women who choose against breastfeeding, to push down the throats of the public an agenda that's naturalistic and quote unquote organic. Mm-hmm. And I perceive that to be a trend right now in science and in society. And that relates somewhat to our conversation around vaccination.
Sure.
That's very much a naturalistic sort of approach. Mm-hmm. So do you see the same thing? Does this make you uncomfortable, this topic?
In a way, it does a little because I have an uncle who is a single parent who adopted a kid, and that kid was...
I have an uncle who's breastfeeding right now.
It would be a bigger story. That would take up much more time on the podcast. So my cousin was never breastfed. He's one of the smartest teenagers I know. So I put it... I always get a little skittish around these attempts at drawing causations from such big correlation data.
Right.
What we have found from other correlation studies is that breastfeeding at a very young age tends to be associated with stronger brain development. That's due to the polyunsaturated fatty acids. Okay, fine. But I think there are nutritional replacements that can cover that. Another possibility is that longer breastfeeding or breastfeeding practices can be associated with stronger attachment in early childhood. Okay, yeah, that can also carry through, but there's ways around that even if you're not breastfeeding. So I think all of these things, there can be a correlation, but you need to be very careful about trying to vilify an individual who might not be breastfeeding your child.
Exactly right. You've expressed that very well, my friend. You have a strong future ahead of you in the
parenting?
I'm going to say, in being a podcast interviewee.
Another 3 more to go.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned the fact that this is a large study with a large number of subjects, and that is a problematic consideration. In many ways, having a large sample size is the goal for many of us because it's hard to find them. But it creates a special kind of problem, and that brings us to the paper called Birth Month Affects Lifetime Disease Risk.
This one was fun.
A phenome-wide method. Right. So, do you want to summarize it for us? Do you remember?
I do. And there was one highlight for me, which I'll say at the end. Basically, these researchers at Columbia, I believe, took years and years of medical record data over thousands and thousands of records and correlated months in which children were born with later onset of 59 diseases or something like that. And what I like about it is they found that people born in May actually have the lowest risk of disease onset.
And you're born in May.
Yep, May 3rd.
Interesting.
And it turns out if you're born in October, then you're shit out of luck because they have the highest incidence of disease. But it varies all across the spectrum. And really what it boils down to, which I didn't think they necessarily emphasized enough, is that being born in different months will expose you to different risks of early childhood development challenges.
Right. And that really is a takeaway message here. But methodologically, it's so interesting because there are, close to 2 million records they looked at?
Huge.
A huge data set. And, of course, as I mentioned before, that is the ultimate, the holy grail for epidemiologists and data scientists. But it brings up specific sorts of statistical problems, particularly something called the multiple testing problem. Are you familiar with multiple testing issues?
I think that might be your area more than mine. So.
I was afraid you'd say that. Multiple testing has to do with if you're doing many things with the same individuals in a data set, it can create the illusion of statistical significance when in fact there isn't any. And I don't think they did that here. I think they controlled for it appropriately. But whenever you see that large of a data set, you have to raise your eyebrow and wonder what the hell is going on here. A good example of this, and I haven't got a copy of this paper, but I bring it up to my students all the time. A few years ago, the Canadian Medical Association Journal published in their Christmas issue a particular paper. You should know that their Christmas issue historically was associated with kind of unusual, jokey science. Mm-hmm. It's real science, but not their best
popular science.
And they did that intentionally just to have some fun. So this paper looked at all the Nobel Prize winners in medicine and asked if there is a pattern with respect to astrological sign with winning Nobel Prize. And I think they discovered that Geminis are statistically more likely to win the Nobel Prize in medicine. I just chose Gemini. It could have been Sagittarius. I don't know. What are you, a Taurus?
Yeah, so I might be out of luck.
Definitely was not Taurus. But anyway, the takeaway message from that wasn't that if you want your child to be a Nobel Prize winner, plan to conceive them such that they will be a Gemini or whatever. The takeaway message was, with a large enough sample size, you can find significance for pretty much anything you want. And that's the bugaboo in this other paper here with 1.7 million individuals, right? Is that if you don't do this just right, you are bound to find some pattern. Now, the other thing that people need to understand, because I've seen this in the media so often, this particular study all over Facebook, because if you believe in horoscopes, as I do not, let's be clear.
Important disclaimer.
Do you believe in horoscopes, Patrick?
No, I haven't checked my horoscope today.
Okay, so it may say that today you feel skeptical.
See if I like it.
Tauruses are skeptical today. If you believe in horoscopes, this is one that we want to cite all the time. No, this is only New York-based births. So we're dealing with a specific place in the world, a specific latitude, a specific climate, a specific dietary environment.
And one other thing, if I can jump in,
sure,
it's
please.
For people born between 1900 and the year 2000.
There it is.
So it's all about this switch up between statistical significance and real life significance.
Could you elaborate a bit more about that?
Sure. It's something that comes up a lot in medicine and in a lot of public health, where just because you can make the numbers work in a way that gets what would be statistically significant, which is a discussion for another day, that does not necessarily translate into a real world impact. So I think what I would emphasize again and again and again from this is people shouldn't be planning on just having May babies and abstaining for the rest of the year. It's a silly and a bit of a fun review, but it's so correlative, and the conditions in 1900 New York are not the same as they are in 2015 Ottawa. So just in terms of real world applicability or relevance to this, I don't think there's too much. I think as far as you can go with it is to say, well, this is this provides an interesting way of looking at what challenges might be faced in early childhood development at different times of the year.
I wonder what Malcolm Gladwell thinks of this.
You know, I wrote that down too. It seemed just like an Outliers chapter to me.
Yeah, I wonder if I can get him on this podcast and ask him without getting too angry at him.
That's funny you mentioned that. Where, people born earlier in the year tend to do better and better.
Right. But I think to be fair to him, I think his rationale was if you're born at a certain time, you're more likely to start school earlier based upon
and do better at sports and stuff like that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It was less about environmental factors, I think.
Yeah. Right. But also, even though the numbers here are real, and as Patrick points out, that statistical significance is not necessarily related to real-world significance, what's probably happening, I think, and I think many of the commentators believe, is environmental factors surrounding the early childhood experience. There's nothing to do with actual horoscope signs here. Nothing to do with celestial events.
Which, to their credit, they do not claim either.
They probably
or maybe
did.
I skimmed. So
maybe they did when they first submitted the paper and the reviewers had them remove it. I don't really believe that, so don't sue me, authors. That would be bad. So since we're having fun with some papers, the last one I want to talk about today is something called an open-label pilot study of homeopathic treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in children and youth, which was published at the University of Toronto last year. Now, those of you who listen to this podcast regularly know of my disdain for homeopathy. And disdain's a strong word. I mean, people can do what they want, and I'm a big believer in individual choice. If it makes you feel better, go for it, but don't claim it's scientific. And the problem with homeopathy, it's not scientific. It's nonsensical. But it's interesting that this particular paper...
very nice restraint, right?
Patrick is giving me the best look right now.
Can't help himself.
This particular paper looked at a group of individuals showing ADHD symptoms, and they were given a homeopathic intervention, and then later on they were assessed for the same symptoms, and the results were that there was a 63% statistically significant improvement in the primary outcome, which was some behavioral characteristic. That's not important. The important part is that this is politically such an interesting paper. Homeopathic studies have been done many times in the past, and they've always been shown to have no particular validity. And the question always arises, why do we keep doing them then?
And it's interesting because they posed that question in this paper.
Did they? I didn't catch that.
Yeah, they sort of say that there's so little evidence for its utility, so we'll do a test of utility.
Right.
And then this one succeeds. And, I won't go as far as you did against homeopathy, but I feel like this is my word of the day. I sort of get a bit skittish or squirrely when I can't understand the mechanism, or the mechanism can't be explained of how this might be improved.
That's true.
And when we're talking about ADHD, I do see how consultation can help. And this is an area where they were doing 10 consultations or something like that. So I can see how that would help. But to say that then homeopathy is the driving factor might be a stretch.
I should clarify my position on homeopathy.
Should you?
It's this. I'm quite open to non-Western methods of medical care, even things for which the mechanism is not clear. What do I know about the world? Very little. So if you have a mechanism or a treatment or an approach that might be helping people, all right, I'm open to it. My hesitation is when you claim that your method, your treatment, your intervention adheres to the rigors of Western science when they don't. Right? So homeopathy is not like Chinese medicine, which is about an experience that sometimes cannot be put into an RCT method, that cannot be assessed via the randomized control trial, because you cannot really control for experience and relationship and those kinds of things. But homeopathy claims to. It claims that it is about the drug, not about the experience. And when we test the efficacy of the drug, it doesn't work. That's my objection to homeopathy. So let's put that aside. In case people think, oh, Ray, you're just an apologist for the big pharma and the military-industrial pharmaceutical complex. No, I do like my drugs, though. By which I mean aspirin. Going back to the paper, though, I think it's important to point out the big flaw in this paper. And I've shown this to my graduate students and asked them to identify the big flaw. It actually worries me that so many of them were not able to identify the big flaw. And I can see how many scientists who are reading this, perhaps on a cursory level, could not see the big flaw. Lots of the University of Toronto's former Nobel Prize winners wrote in to complain about the big flaw. So Patrick and I already discussed this earlier this afternoon, but let me just say the big flaw is there's no control group. They just looked at the treatment group. And for pretty much any group of individuals, you tend to get better anyway, regardless of the intervention. The real test of whether an intervention works is, are you getting better more so than another group is getting better? Is your treatment group doing better than a control group? It's insufficient to just look at the treatment group. That's easy. So in many ways, I suspect, and I'm going to phrase this very carefully because I don't want to get sued, I question the motivation behind this particular design. A truly altruistic design that's seeking to elucidate wisdom about this endeavor would have sought to employ the most rigorous type of epidemiological design, and this is not it. So I will perhaps best way to phrase it that way.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to get any help from me on this one.
I wish you could see the look. Maybe I should make these podcasts video because he's giving me the most incredible...
Hey, you already have your university job, okay, so
We'll see
I'm not going to go around burying other researchers.
Yeah, maybe I should retract that statement. I'm guilty of some of this too. I remember I did a study many years ago. I won't say which one. It was on death rates and driving accidents after 9/11. And we were wondering whether after 9/11 Americans drove more and therefore died more so than they would have had they flown.
Okay.
So was the fear of flying unrealistic that it actually drove people to die? And what we found that yes, it did. But we only looked at numerator data, I realize with horror today, right? Which is completely nonsensical. We got it published though. So you guys can look up that paper on my website if you like. But yeah, the actual numbers of deaths increased, but did the number of drivers increase also? I don't know. Right. So it means very little. And I'm surprised that was able to get published. But then again, maybe I shouldn't be because this was able to get published also, this homeopathy paper. So there we have it. So that was 20 minutes of dissecting 3 fun papers. Is there a theme that runs through all 3? Can you see?
Well, now we've made a few more enemies across several different countries.
Okay, I've made enemies. It's not Patrick's fault. Leave him alone until he's rich and famous, then you go after him.
But I think in all 3 of them, you see that motivation to publish, right? Yeah. And driven behind all of that is associating findings with real-world significance. And I'm not trying to question the way other people might have, the methodological rigor or the statistical significance of what some of these papers found. What I'm saying is that while they can be fun and sort of generate conversation, I don't think any of them are necessarily of a position where real life practices need to be changed straight away.
They're not relevant to policy. And I tend to agree. The funny part about these is that like the one on the horoscope or the birth month affecting lifetime disease risk, that's a secondary data analysis. The data's there, it's in the records. It doesn't cost a lot of money. You just extract them and analyze them. That's fine. The homeopathy one, that's not a very big study. It's about how many people they have? 9 people? 10 people they looked at?
They just kept talking about how this was a test of feasibility.
Right.
For a larger scale one. And so
okay. And I guess that's fair enough.
That one lost me more than the other 2, actually.
Yeah, it's quite vague. But it didn't look very expensive or time-consuming. They took a number of people, they gave them a fake drug, and they tested to see if they improved or not. But the Brazilian one is astounding to me. You've got, how many people was it again?
Go back and check. It's over 30 years.
Was it 5,000?
Almost 6,000.
6,000 people. That's over 30 years. That's a lot of money and effort for a finding that really is inconclusive. So that's the one that mystifies me more than the others. I don't mind doing weird science, but when it eats up that much resources...
Yeah, but I do think that there is science behind at least 2 of them, which I'd like to talk about a bit. Okay. The birth month one is fun and it's interesting, but then it does ask the question, sort of, how is summertime or fall-time pollen affecting kids?
Sure.
How does maybe vitamin D deficiency in the wintertime affect early childhood development? And if these are big factors, then those are things that policy can address, and those are things that could maybe create lifelong benefits. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily claiming that, but it's saying that it's worth looking into.
Right.
So I think that they found an interesting way of looking at data, which is both fun and accessible to the public, as you can see from it being picked up by the media and stuff, as well as with potential benefits down the road. The Brazilian one, I think, is also interesting to the extent, I mean, it just seems to reinforce further to me that early childhood development is important, and there is the possibility that healthy breastfeeding practices play a role in that.
Right. No, I tend to agree 100%. I mean, I tend to agree 100%. That makes no sense. I do agree 100%. And also I tend to agree. I'm trying to look at the journals. Yeah, so the Brazilian one was a Lancet paper, right? The Lancet does not publish nonsense except for that one paper that falsely showed an association between vaccination and autism. But it's a high-quality journal. And so I know they must have understood the fatal flaw there of the inability to measure and control for maternal intelligence. But I think their rationalization was, yeah, that's true, but this is our only chance now to do some kind of attempt at associating breastfeeding with intelligence, and they went for it. The danger, of course, is when the media gets a hold of it, and twists it.
Yeah. But I mean, I think there is a health benefit to early childhood breastfeeding. I'm not saying 2 years. I'm saying, I think WHO recommends up to 6 months, and there are reasons for that. There's ways to get around that if you're unable to. Mothers, please don't come to my apartment. I'm just saying that there are health benefits to breastfeeding.
I think we can all agree, though, that breastfeeding should end around puberty at the latest.
It's a good time to sign off now.
Puberty of the child, not the mother. So maybe we'll
edit it out later.
Yeah, maybe. All right. So thank you, Patrick, for another interesting conversation.
Thank you.
And once again, if you want to know more about Patrick, he's the one with the clean mind and the pristine record, and the person with the great future, and I'm the one whose career clearly is over. Go to the website, deonandan.com, deonandan.com, click on podcast, scroll down to this episode, and you can access these papers as well as a link to Patrick's biography. Thank you very much.